Well, hello there. It's Andrea Hallwagner, registered dietitian and CEO of Health Stand Nutrition. Here we are talking about something very embarrassing that can happen to a lot of people that are training for a run, a sport, triathlon, or just generally gym fitness goers. This is a common subject that comes up in our practice behind closed doors. So I'm opening it up to have a live discussion about runner's diarrhea and just other digestive issues that can sometimes show up when you are doing exercise. So if you're watching live or you're catching the replay, of course, I'm happy to take questions on this subject or hear from you on your personal experiences if you're willing to share. But if not, if it's a private thing for you, don't worry. I'm hoping at least that I'm going to provide you with some explanations about why runner's diarrhea and digestive issues can happen in the first place, and then also what to do about it to try and prevent some of these issues from showing up in the first place. So let's start off here by really digging into why things like reflux. So reflux is more sort of what we talk about in terms of heartburn or food kind of coming up as you're exercising might be more common, as well as just overall diarrhea and gas, bloating, cramping, all of the fun digestive issues that we certainly don't want to have when we're exercising, why they show up in the first place. So the first thing to notice here is that there's a decrease in pressure that happens in our body between the esophagus, the long tube that runs between your back of your throat all the way into your stomach. So there's a little valve called the lower-esophageal sphincter, and in between that esophagus and your stomach is that little LES, or that lower esophageal sphincter valve. And what we find is that that valve stays really tight on a normal basis if you've not got any significant heartburn or reflux issues. But during exercise, the pressure goes away, and so it gets a little bit looser, and it's why you can be more sensitive to food kind of coming back and haunting you, especially if you've had foods like onions and garlic and spice and acidic types of foods. You're going to definitely experience more likelihood of having those kind of come back and haunt you a bit there. So that's one thing that happens during exercise. The other thing that happens is during physical activity, there's changes in what's happening in the muscle of our digestive system. So the small intestine actually slows down the overall muscle sort of peristalsis, we call it in the nutrition field, how your muscles kind of move food through the small intestine actually slows during physical activity. But what actually speeds up is actually movement of fecal material through the large intestine. And the large intestine is, of course, where your body is really processing stool, it's processing water. And we find, because the muscle is trying to move everything out as we're exercising, that's why we tend to find people struggle a little bit more with things like cramping and diarrhea and just not feeling particularly good during exercise. So that's kind of the science, the quick science tip as to sort of what's going on and why this might be showing up and happening. The other thing that's also happening is there's a reduction in blood flow to the arteries that supply the small and large intestine. And that's because blood at that time, when we're exercising, is being really shunted to the working muscles. And so that change in just what is happening in terms of blood flow is also one of the reasons that we can experience some issues with our digestive system. So who's likely to suffer more from digestive issues? You may wonder, am I the only one that has this? If you've experienced a very sharp, urgent need to get off whatever you were doing and literally book it over to the bathroom, you are certainly not alone. This is a very, very common challenge. What we tend to find is that the higher the intensity of exercise, the more likely that runner's diarrhea and digestive issues are going to show up for you. And that's because if you think about it, all of those physiologic changes are happening, blood flow shifts are happening on a bigger level when we're doing something very, very intense from an exercise perspective. We also tend to associate more issues with longer endurance sports, hence the term runner's diarrhea. It's super common when we talk about marathon, half marathon distances, triathlon, cycling, where things are going to be happening over a longer period of time. More likely that stuff is going to show up the longer you are exercising. The other thing that, of course, we find is that if you've got a sensitive gut to begin with, if you currently have any issues with IBS, diarrhea, constipation, you may find that exercise only further sort of adds to some distress in terms of what's happening in your gut. And that's because if you've got a sensitive gut, it's probably not going to, exercise is not going to do any favors for what you might be experiencing in terms of symptoms there. The other thing we know is you're more likely to suffer from runner's diarrhea and cramping, bloating, urgency in terms of diarrhea if you're eating the wrong types of food. And so I'm going to talk a lot more about that. But on a surface or a general rule of thumb, foods that are really high in fiber, foods that are really high in fat, and even foods quite high in protein are quite slow to digest. And that means they're going to be hanging around in the stomach a little bit longer and often can contribute more digestive distressors or cramping and issues for people that have a sensitive tummy. So those are some top line ones. And then as I mentioned earlier on, if you suffer with what we call GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, or you've more often experienced reflux or food kind of coming back at you as you're starting a run or doing some exercise, then what you're going to find is that there's a lot of more issue when we talk about foods like acidic foods, such as you think of citrus types of fruits, tomatoes, and then very spicy foods. So, I mean, logical here, an Indian style curry, fantastic to eat, but maybe not right before going out for exercise, because of course, all of that spice can create more reflux or more issue in terms of food coming back at you. So those are a couple of things to keep in mind, but I want to dig into some more specifics here. And what you're going to find associated with this video, I've left a website link there. It's healthstandnutrition.com/runners diarrhea. And you can read way more about this stuff there. All the points that I'm going through today are found in that blog post. So feel free to grab a copy if that's helpful for you to have something to read along with, or read instead of watch, whichever your preference there. But I want to dig into some key nutrition recommendations here. And I've got 5 of them I want to go through on how we can prevent some of this runner's diarrhea and digestive issues from even showing up in the first place. So the first thing is number 1 is familiar and tested. And so what I'm after here is that different things work for different people. We know some people just have super sensitive stomachs, some people do not. Many years ago when I started off in my career as a dietitian, way back in 2000 when I first started my business, I worked a lot with competitive athletes in a variety of different sports. And that was through a sports facility in town, now called the Talisman Center, but previously back in the day, I had started off the nutrition programming at Lindsay Park Sports Center. And then I worked alongside Kellyanne Erdman, one of my dietitian colleagues, at the time was called Canadian Sports Center Calgary. And so we worked with a lot of athletes ranging from bobsled, luge to women's hockey, speed skating, and then, of course, different summer sports, whether that was swimming or gymnastics, and the list went on. And we always ran across issues related to digestive issues in both recreational athletes as well as competitive athletes. And we found one of the key things was having something familiar and tested, especially if you are going to be competing. So whether you're a competitive-based athlete, super key, you test out everything in your training sessions so you really know on the days that it counts what is going to be tolerated well. And for those of you that are more recreational fitness enthusiasts, again, the same strategy is so important here. I'm always surprised at how many people try a different sport during different gel, a bar, alongside a race course on a half marathon that they've never tried before. So bad idea. You never know how your stomach is going to tolerate something new, especially when you throw nerves and stress. Also another challenge when we get into the digestive system. So familiar and tested is absolutely your golden rule of thumb if you're going to be doing any competing. Now, number 2, timing. This one is also super individual. You're gonna hear me say a lot through this, through the points here, is that different things are gonna work differently for different people. And so for myself, as more of a recreational runner, do a lot of mountain biking and cycling in our family, cross-country skiing, downhill skiing. Most of the sports that I like to do are a little bit more forgiving with the digestive system, with the exception of running, where we're not bouncing as a cyclist. So our digestive system tends to be able to tolerate the timing of when you're eating a little bit more, with a little bit more grace and flexibility than if you're running. And so the type of sport, I think, is also really relevant here when we're talking about it. But here's a rough rule of thumb. So if you know you've got a super, super sensitive stomach, you've had difficulty with this before, you're training for an upcoming race, triathlon, running race of some sort, what I'd like you to do is in your training runs, do a couple of practices where you've got nothing in the system for at least 2 hours, maybe closer to 3 for some of you that have got really severe IBS and just stomach issues. Give it a good 3 hours with nothing in your stomach, and then go out and see how your body responds to that. Now that means that meal that you're having 3 hours in advance is gonna have to be substantial enough to carry you. So we're not talking about just grabbing a banana here and hoping that coasts you, because you're gonna start running or start your race in a low blood sugar kind of fatigued way. So we're talking about something that's got a good mix of carbs and protein. Definitely stay away from anything too really high in fat, because it slows down overall digestion. Something like a sandwich, a smoothie with a little bit of protein in it, something like that would be a good thing to test about 3 hours before and see if that does the job. Now, those of you that are, you got a stomach of steel, things don't seem to bother you as much, then you're probably going to be able to get away with the timing of your meal and snack to be much, much closer to the time that you're going to be doing your race. And so oftentimes we'll give people the rule of thumb somewhere between 1, 2, or 3 hours, some sort of a light snack. Mostly carbs are going to be important here because they're quick to digest. Is going to be the way that you want to think about your timing there. Okay, so next sort of on our list here. Number 3, liquid versus solid. This is an interesting one. So again, if you've had a lot of trouble with this in the past, you may find simply sipping on a sport drink before your workouts, especially if it's going to be fairly intense, you've got lots of nerves involved, you may find something that's drinkable is going to be an easier thing for your body to tolerate. Now, some people can do smoothies. Some people can't before exercise. It really depends, again, on your level of digestive tolerance. What we know is if you've taken a huge amount of carbohydrate coming from fruit, for some people, and it's quite rare, but a small percentage of athletes, they do get a little bit more risk of cramping with fructose, the type of natural carbohydrate that's found in fruit. And that's one of the reasons that sport drinks actually use very little fructose, or they'll use a blend and just use it as one of the major sugar sources alongside things like sucrose and glucose, which tend to be easier for the body to digest. So if you've had difficulty with cramping before, digestive issues, again, I'm going to ask you, are you drinking a lot of fruit flavored beverages? Are you having a lot of fruit before? Because fruit is great, but for the odd person, because it is metabolized differently in the gut, we do find that the odd person has more difficulty with that. And so you may find carbs coming from things like your grains group, such as whether it's crackers or granola bars or rice, potatoes, something like that might be easier for you to manage than fruit. So a little experimenting both on should it be liquid or solid, and again thinking about are smoothies a win for you or maybe not a fit for you. It can go either way. The vast majority of people will be just fine, but I did want to give that tidbit just in case you're one of the rare people wondering what the heck happens if I eat a couple of bananas and go out for a run and I experience cramping. You're probably someone that's just a little bit more sensitive to fructose. So thought I would mention that. Now, number 4, water and carbohydrate considerations. So again, hydration always so key. What we know is that staying hydrated is really important because it, when you're dehydrated, it can reduce your overall blood flow, which turns, can, put you more at risk for diarrhea over time. And so if you know that exercise is going to be longer than an hour, hour and a half, sometimes taking in some fluids, and if not, a sport drink can be really performance beneficial for you. And again, just a little bit more experimenting here so that you're starting your race or your training session fueled with some good carbs in the muscles as well as in your blood sugar so you can push hard through that workout. After all, carbs are your gasoline stores for your muscles, so you need a little bit of them to get the benefit of that workout, and certainly water. because your muscle, 70% water, folks. If you don't get some good water coming in, it's going to be difficult for your muscles to want to do its job. Number 5, foods to avoid before activity. If you've got a stomach that is not booked and built out of steel, and you're finding that you're experiencing digestive distress a lot, what you're going to want to do here is really make sure you're sticking to lower fiber-based foods, lower fat-based foods. This is not the time when we want to see people loading up on lots of healthy avocados and nuts and seeds, olive oils. These are great things to have just afterwards when that exercise is already done, because before, they take a long time to digest, and so they just hang around in the stomach for a very long time. So I'm going to encourage you to go with foods that we know digest really quickly, which, you guessed it, is carbohydrates. So we're thinking about things like your fruits, your veggies, your grains. Sweets and treats, of course, can fit there, although just a few of those, right? We want to save those for more of our soulful eating experiences, probably more socially than we do right before a training session. So that's kind of the key things there. When we talk about foods to avoid, the other one would be experimenting with how your body tolerates caffeine. Now, the interesting thing with caffeine is we know a lot of people have difficulty with their digestive system, and of course their morning coffee helps to keep their bowel habits really regular, since it does have a laxative-based effect. And so that may or may not be a good thing for you, depending on what's happening with your digestive system. Oftentimes what we find is that what you typically do most days is what you want to keep doing on an important race day. If you've got a 10K race booked for an upcoming summer run, keep on going with what you normally do and practice how your body is responding to that well in advance, so you know, okay, if I do a super early morning run and I've had a coffee, how does my gut like this? So there's no surprises on your race day. On the other hand, because we do know that caffeine can have a laxative-based effect and can increase the transit time, meaning increase how quickly food will move through the lower intestine, some people are going to need to really wean down on the amount of caffeine they have, because it just isn't going so well with their exercise and their digestive system reacting together. So a little bit of experimenting here. It can be beneficial, it can be not so beneficial, depending on what's happening with your gut. So I am hoping that gives you a couple of things. We talked about the 5 things here to really think about. We talked about making that pre-exercise meal familiar and tested. We talked about timing. Again, if you've got a super sensitive stomach, you might want to have that stomach almost empty 3 hours before. But again, a lot of us can handle food, 1, 2, or 3 hours before and be just fine. So a little experimenting there. Number 3 was liquid versus solid. So really experimenting with, what do I need to do here? Do I need, if I've got a particularly sensitive stomach, would something more drinkable and even just a sport drink before be the easiest thing for my gut to be able to tolerate? Number 4, water and carb consideration. So coming in hydrated, coming in with some good topped up carbohydrates for you that are the quickest to digest are going to be key to think about. And then number 5, foods to avoid. You bet, we've got not too much fiber, not too much fat. Caffeine, we're saying maybe, maybe not, just depending on your tolerance again. And not too much protein either. So I bring up that one and just expand on that last point a little bit more. Sometimes I find in the athletic community, there's so much emphasis on eating higher protein-based foods that people sometimes don't have the understanding that right before exercise, we don't want a huge amount of protein there. It's just going to hang around in the gut a long time and really isn't the source of where our muscles are going to draw energy. That comes from carbohydrate. So protein, the best time to really load up on an extra dose of protein is, of course, in recovery, when those muscles are repairing itself and you want a solid meal that's going to really keep you full and sustained with energy. So I'm Andrea Hallwegner, registered dietitian at HealthStand Nutrition here. If we can help you with anything related to gearing up for a sport, a training session, we have a sport dietitian on my team here that's probably very keen to meet you and sit down and talk all about your everyday training diet to make sure you're getting the most out of all your exercise sessions, and really work with you on maybe some of the more complicated issues you might be having, whether that's related to body composition, confusion over what to eat before, during, after a meal, long distance endurance training nutrition strategies for our Ironman and marathon-based athletes. And then, of course, if you need some more support on digestive health, that's something that we can give you a hand with here at HealthStand Nutrition. So feel free to leave me a comment if you found this helpful. Share the episode on your page, like our Facebook page here so you can hear about our upcoming next sessions on our weekly Facebook Lives. And if you like more ideas around everyday healthy eating strategies, healthy recipes, and you don't want to miss some of our upcoming videos, just hop on over to the homepage of our website. You can sign up for our free weekly newsletter. We spend lots of time each week putting together really high value content. So I'd love you to come over, test drive our newsletter called Sound Bites. And you can find it right on the top page of our homepage of our website there, and test drive it, see if you like it. And of course, if you don't, you can unsubscribe at any time. So look forward to seeing you next week. And thanks again so much for watching.